Greetings all, Dr. Raphael X here with my friend Jeremy to continuing to discuss philosophical topics. Today we'll be discussing the brain, mind, or brain/soul issue, which is a very important philosophical issue. Please subscribe, click on the like button, share this video, leave a comment, notifications, all that good stuff. All right, so today we're going to talk about, well, basically, you see this passing in on psychology, where all the sciences have become materialistic, really reducing any type of immateriality to the brain. Basically, we are matter. We are just bodies. There is no immaterial aspect about us, nothing that transcends the soul, and everything is reducible to the brain, some biological function. Right? This is how right, this is the sufficient reason of man, of all his powers and faculties, and there's really is no soul. So can we show that a soul exists using philosophy alone? Is it just the object of religion, or is the existence of an immaterial aspect in man something that is, right, philosophically provable, something that we can know through reason? Or are we stuck, right, with the materialists and just saying, no, the brain is the soul, the brain is the mind, we are just brain, and again, subject to these the functions of it? So well, let's let my friend here, Jeremy, come in, and yeah, if you'd like to chime in here, we'd like to hear what you got to say.
Sure, sounds good, Doc. I think there's a number of lines of attack here concerning this problem. We can begin with the most obvious, take an obvious empirical fact, and then see how it can be solved logically and philosophically. Right. So, if it is so that a bird can fly without wings, then it is a fact that flight is not does not absolutely require wings. Wings may be helpful, but not a necessary or not a sufficient condition for flight. Right? There's a concept of necessary but not sufficient. For example, it is necessary to have chocolate chips in order to have chocolate chip cookies, but it is not sufficient, because even if I have the chocolate chips, then I still need to bake the cookies and I need all the other ingredients. So, concerning the brain, right, it is a medical fact that, for example, in a condition such as hydrocephalus, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, individuals can be missing large parts of their brain. Right? Now, to some extent, something that has been called neuroplasticity can be cited. You see, half the hemisphere is missing, but there have been perfectly well documented cases of upwards of 95% or so of the brain being missing, essentially entirely gone. And admittedly, in some cases, there is a high degree of intellectual incapacity in connection with such absence of brain tissue. But in at least some cases, the IQ is even over 100. There's one, again, very well documented instance of a student with 126, I believe it was, IQ, who graduated school with a math degree that was missing 95% of his brain. Right? There are instances of individuals missing their brain completely, being born without any brain whatsoever, just a brain stem. And yet, as far as it would seem, always incapacitated. It is so, but still, according to at least their parents, able to recognize caretakers, able to make facial expressions, able to move about in simple ways, able to have some vision, at least in one report. So we have a fact here that high levels of mental function are possible with the areas of the brain that are normally cited as necessary for them being absent. So now we have to try to explain that fact logically, philosophically, conceptually, what have we, but it still is a fact. Again, if it was so that a bird could fly without wings, as does a bird with wings, then we would have to say, well, wings cannot be absolutely necessary for flying. Maybe the bird has a secret jetpack or an engine or something like this. So starting from that fact, we can then reason as to how that can be explained. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. So it's kind of in scholastic philosophy coming from Aristotle. Um, Basically, man has faculties for things. So, like for example, even if you didn't have the eye, you would still have the faculty of seeing. So it's not the eye that sees, right? It's the person that sees through the instrument of the eye, which is a not the eye is not the cause of seeing, rather, but the condition of seeing, a necessary condition. Well, maybe there's some causal relation, but really, the one that sees is the person, right? So, and this goes to show that, if something were to be healed or whatever, that person could go on seeing. So that the faculty is still there, which goes to show that there is a deeper reality that's not just simply physical or biological. Now, one of the interesting proofs is that I remember Descartes saying that the body and soul are united in the pineal gland, which is kind of interesting because he said the soul is totally accidental to the body. But that aside, we'll probably address that again. But it does seem that what makes you you? Like what makes Fred Fred? I mean, we know scientifically, what is it? You correct me, is it 7 or 10 years? I forget how. When when your body is totally renewed, right? Because the multiplication of cells die out. There's new cells. You are not yourself physically, right? You are your whole new self. So what, through this transcourse, through, moment to moment, after 10 years, what is that continuum that makes you you? It has to be something that is not material, because again, material, you in the material aspect, every 10 years or so, I forget how many years it is, you are totally renewed. So if you are just your brain, right, it would make sense that what maintains that continuum, and it has to be something that's immaterial. Another proof really is interesting with the life functions, and the existence of life cannot be denied. Biology, bios, meaning life, the study of life. Life exists. Now, there can't be an infinite regress of causes in the material sense. There can't be an infinite regress of material causes, right? So even this movement right here, my arm, what causes that to move? Well, maybe you can say the nerves, right? Well, what causes the nerves to function? Well, the brain. What causes that? Well, the neurons. What causes that? Right? What causes that? What causes that? You cannot have an infinite regression of material causes by definition, because by definition, matter is finite. So there has to be a first cause, and that first cause cannot be material. That'd be absurd. That first cause must be something immaterial, right? And this we know to be the soul. What's also interesting is that originally mens, translated from Latin, mens or suhe, right, from psychology, was referred to the immaterial reality of the mind, what Anaxagoras called nous. This was not, psychology was originally the study of the immaterial aspect of man, right? The study of the soul. Only recently has the soul and the brain been conflated, right? There's a very recent phenomenon, right? We could say Freud has pushed this a lot, where man is reduced to nothing more than his matter, when originally it was not so in the very sciences, right? In science before, also, we talked about this before, wasn't merely experimental, it wasn't done merely in a lab, it was philosophical, right? And it was using these deductive arguments to arrive at the primary stuff of life, what makes things alive, and it has to be this this immaterial principle called well, not nous is the mind, but rather called suhe or mens, right, the mind. If you want to.
Yeah, those are some great points. So the idea that there is something superadded onto the material substratum of the organism has been expelled from biology, fortunately or not, something called vitalism. And yet, to expel the idea that there is some kind of superfluous, kind of maybe mist or entity that is somehow attached and somehow it inserts itself into the purported mechanism of biological function is not the same thing as saying that it is possible to at all grasp what it is that an organism is without, for example, teleology, without supposing that means are aligned to ends. And any remotely reasonable study of organisms, I think, cannot be had at all without the presupposition that means are aligned to ends. For example, if you cut off the tail of, for example, certain types of lizards and newts, it grows back. Presumably that's because a tail is something that is applicable to the given organism. Many studies have been done where there's a tremendous degree of interference that can be had with the organism, say in this embryonic stage, where it will still turn out to be per the original plan. You can remove a substantial part of the brain. Right? A child can be born with a very small part of the brain and it will grow back. There's you can look it up on YouTube. There's an interview with a fine young man who's 6 or 7 years old who was born with around 3% of his brain, severely intellectually incapacitated. The brain grew back. Right? So to say that there's no internal organization, right, to cite one biologist, it is preposterous. Things that are externally organized, the contents of one's desk, that I have a pencil and a lamp and a computer on my desk, that only can be supposed to be a unity within a given subjectivity, such as one's own. I look out onto a landscape and I see the mountain, the cloud, the tree. To say that that is an internally connected unity is bizarre. How so? They're externally connected. They're connected in my own particular apprehension. Yet an organism does not seem to be like that. There seems to be internal unity, aka what has been historically called teleology, right? An alignment of means to ends. Now, thinking then about the relation of the brain, here we see one very kind of possibly the most abstract argument that can be made, or the most general argument would be that any and all content, sense-connected content, has to, by necessity, come to us in our apprehension, in our sentience, and the brain is no exception. By the term brain can be meant something that can be seen, can be meant something that can be touched, perhaps smelt, and unfortunately eaten with cannibals or with other animals. We can, excuse me. And any and all of that content has to be on the same epistemic footing as any and all other content in our experience. And therefore, we cannot, strictly speaking, reverse the causal chain and say that any of that content causes or so-called consciousness and intelligence itself. Again, if that makes any sense. Right? Let's say that I close my eyes and I imagine being somebody else, so-and-so, Mr. or Miss so-and-so. Any and all content in my imaginary world, or if I fall asleep and I have a dream, anything and everything that I dream is coming to me in my what is called sentience. Right? Now, that would include any purported brain, any internal content of the body that I am conceiving. By no means is that to say that life is a dream or anything like that. It's just to highlight the epistemology here, that any such content is on the same footing of knowledge. So we can't take a little bit of that content and say, oh, well, this content here that you can find in an MRI scan or a CAT scan, it really causes your consciousness itself, or causes your capacities of intelligence in and of their own self. So that's philosophically, kind of logically. And then we have the empirical evidence, which shows that tremendous neuroplasticity. It said that if you teach a child to write with their right hand, the language center will develop in the left hemisphere. You teach them to write with their left hand, the language center will develop in the right hemisphere. You remove the language center at a sufficiently early age, give the brain a little bit of time, it may very well and hopefully shall pop up in a different area. So to have some kind of mechanical, non-teleological, teleological, however it's pronounced, model where the brain is itself what causes all of these capacities, never mind that it causes consciousness or that it causes intelligence, is reminiscent of naive Victorian age materialism, and certainly is not up to par of contemporary scientific and philosophical thought, in my view.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, just to build on what you were saying, there's a basic philosophical principle that says the effect cannot surpass the cause, right? In its greatness and in its greatness in its being. So the effect cannot be superior to the cause, because essentially you can't give what you don't have. So the effect receives everything from the cause. So uh, it can't right be superior to it. So what's interesting is that if we're doing things, the effects, like for example, we're forming ideas, and think about the capacity of our minds. The capacity of our minds are, put it say, quasi infinite, to not say infinite. I mean, we can, and our functions are quasi infinite. We are able to pretty much do anything and think anything. It's really fascinating, and it truly changes us. When we obtain a new notion, we are intentionally mentally changed. So that's the effect. So what's the cause behind it? And this is very scientific, because science goes by, well, it tries to understand the cause, but through the knowledge of the effect, because basic scientific principle, every effect has a cause and every cause has an effect. They're essentially related. So from these effects that we're able to form ideas, right? We're able to know definitions of things. Think about the number of definitions you can know. You can literally know all the definitions in the dictionary and more. That cannot, the cause of that cannot be something material. It makes no sense. So and kind of what you're saying too, with the imagination. If I were to imagine right now, um, a chair. Let's say I imagine a chair, something that is bigger than my brain. If we're going to be strictly materialistic, what part of my brain, you would have to say, well, this part of my brain pertains to this part of the chair, then this part of the brain refers to this part of the chair, but it makes no sense, because ideas are immaterial, right? And since the ideas are immaterial, the cause must be immaterial, and hence we have the immaterial soul, right? Ideas are not heavy, right? They don't weigh anything. They're non-material. So to kind of reduce ideas to their biological function is just nonsense. I mean, it's a reductionism that, as you alluded to, is absurd. Ideas are spiritual, therefore their cause, that which produces them, is also spiritual. So again, the scientific method of going from the effects to the cause. Um, so the biological processes, right, can explain how, right, can help us in a biological sense of how they are produced. But what are the ideas themselves, right? What are ideas themselves? You cannot reduce that to a biological function, right? The biology, of course, helps. There's an intimate unity between matter and what's immaterial. And it is fair to say that, immaterial is negatively known, because we say immaterial, not material, invisible, not visible, kind of like immortal, not mortal. But nevertheless, we know its existence, maybe not directly, because we sense things first. We know sense objects directly, but through the senses, we're able to penetrate and deduce, again, using philosophy, the existence of a immaterial realm. And we see this clearly in man, right? How do you judge what we are? Judge what we do, right? And the forming of ideas. I mean, if this doesn't make us godlike, the forming of ideas and the freedom that we have, right? And this is another problem we could probably get into, a very known problem, that freedom is made impossible if everything is just reduced to matter, because of course everything's just subject to the scientific laws. But we know we're free. We immediately perceive that, right? So the ultimate cause, the explanation of that freedom, has to be the immateriality of the soul, which makes us microcosmoses, right? Which really makes us independent and moral agents. So if you want to.
Yeah, great points, Professor. We could touch upon, for starters, distinction that has been made historically by the way of Aristotle. I think transmitted to either Averroes or Alexander the A's, whatever it might be, but the idea of the active intellect as distinguished from the passive intellect. I mean, Aristotle suggested that We have a passive function to perceive, to reflexively react, for example. And that's one thing. And the active intellect, such that is able to apprehend, as you were mentioning, ideas and ideals, and is that which is able to engage in true reason, is something different than the passive intellect. So, based on the empirical evidence concerning the brain and the logic, it would seem that the brain can be helpful, but insufficient. We wouldn't even say necessary due to certain cases such as hydrocephalus and so forth, but certainly helpful. And sometimes maybe we can say necessary, such as if neuroplasticity does not permit reconfiguration to enable a given function. Helpful or necessary, but certainly insufficient tool for the passive intellect, for perception and such, but for the active intellect, for the capacity to contend with ideas and ideals, and to truly contemplate and reason in a way befitting the dignity of a Homo sapien. We cannot, it would seem, give credit to any kind of aspect of our organism for that. And yet that is a capacity that takes development. We see that an infant certainly does not have ability to engage what Aristotle would call the active intellect, and neither does an individual that has not minded themselves morally and built themselves up as a whole human being from the perspective of mind, character, and such. I can be reduced quite easily to more or less an organism where I simply react, where I am unable to reason on any higher level. And we see that through violence onto ourselves, intellectually and morally, we can do that to ourselves. And consequently, one of the characteristics of the degenerating individual is that there is an inability to reason. There is an inability to contend with ideas, aside from those which relate strictly to self-interest. So we don't have to, have it that black and white. We can say that the brain, as being part of the organism, in the organic substratum, in relation to which, or in connection with which, or in light of which, any higher human personality would be developed, is a helpful or necessary but not sufficient tool. But as for the development of higher human personality and the higher aspects and functions of intellect, again, what Aristotle called active intellect, that cannot at all be reduced to, as was mentioned, any aspect of the organism.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah, I remember the passive and active intellect in epistemology, and Thomas builds on that too. Well, the active intellect, basically, it dematerializes the thing that is known through the senses, which is a whole process. And this is fascinating, because the idea itself is known by the intellect, which is what we have, and the object of the intellect is the universal, right? The universal, which is dematerialized. So it's from the singular. So as St. Thomas describes it, based on Aristotle, we first sense experience individual things, that concrete things, and we're able to despoil them of their common traits, of everything of that singularity, to despoil it of its materiality, and intentionally obtain the universal of the thing, right? So it's this and it's really profound, and this is what happens with materialists. So all philosophy is basically either is really a struggle between idealism and materialism. Like a lot of materialist, the materialist beliefs are just based on kind of laziness, because it's an idealism too, right? Idealism in the extreme form say, well, Berkeley, I think it's pronounced Barclay, but spelled Berkeley. He was a bishop, Anglican bishop. He said only ideas exist, right? We are just minds, basically. That matter doesn't exist, right? An extreme opposite of a materialist, who say that just matter exists. But what's really interesting, you mentioned Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and this perennial philosophy, which is profound. The truth is always in the synthesis, without a doubt. So these philosophers synthesize materialism and the idealism, or materialism and extreme type of maybe maybe spiritualism or immaterialism. I had a friend who was an immaterialist, actually. He believed that matter is an illusion. Matter does not exist, which is interesting. A lot of people in the quantum realm, there's something called quantum philosophy now, quantum metaphysics. They tend to be immaterialists because now science, apparently, this in a subatomic reality, we're getting into the immaterial realm. But anyway, that's beside the point. But basically, the truth is in the synthesis. So Thomas Aquinas says, yes, they're both legit. They both exist, matter and the immaterial realm. So how do we harmonize that? Like, how does a thing become an idea? Ideas exist. We know they exist. We can define things. Universals have some type of existence. This goes back to the problem of universals. What's the nature of the universals? Are we Platonic, saying that they actually exist in another world? Or are we just the other extreme would be Occam, which I think you mentioned, which is say they don't exist at all. It's only singular things exist. Universals have no basis in reality. So there is a middle ground where the universals, yes, they exist in reality. They have a foundation in reality, but the soul is able to know them. The soul is able to abstract them from sensible things. So as Thomas Aquinas would say, the first thing we know are sensible things, right? And from there, there's a whole process of dematerialization that is done. So first you sense it, then you form the sense image, which he calls the phantasm. And from there, the agent intellect goes there and totally dematerializes it. And then once it passes to the passive intellect, then you have the idea. So the passive intellect and agent intellect, or active intellect.
The active intellect, yeah.
Yeah, active agent, the same thing. I believe they're synonymous. I don't know if Aristotle had a different, slightly different view on that, but this is Aristotle. I believe they're the same, agent or active, and then they say passive or potential intellect. So that once the idea passes to the passive intellect, then it's totally dematerialized, and that will show that that's the part of the soul. So it's a process that happens like this, not with much effort, um, not with any effort. It's instantaneous, and that's how we form our ideas, which are universals, right? When I say ideas, I mean definitions of things, like what things are, like man, rational, animal, right? Things are hard to define, actually, sometimes, but yeah, these kind of things. So it shows, right? Like and another example, like justice. We know we see just acts, but we're able to abstract from there, and it passes to the passive or potential intellect, the notion of justice, right? The immaterial reality of justice. And this shows, because we can know that through abstraction, this shows that we are immaterial, right? We have something that transcends the brain. It's not just something material.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting way to put it, Doc. That the passive intellect, if I understood you correctly, is that which grasps sensible content, and then having stripped it of its individuatedness,
Well, it's actually,
active intellect is able to grasp.
what happens. So the senses grab, like, almost passively. So this is a whole process. So the senses grab, and the senses only get a certain aspect of the thing, right? Like a smell, see. So let's say you have a hamburger, you smell the hamburger, you see the hamburger, maybe you taste the hamburger. But then there's something called the common sense. So first you have senses that they don't communicate with each other, but then they go to the common sense, which reunites all the senses, and then it makes a sense image in you, which is like in the imagination. Like, you could picture the hamburger with your eyes closed, but from there the agent intellect acts, despoils it, and passes it on to the passive intellect. And that is
Passes on to the active intellect, you mean? Or
to no, the active one. So the passive intellect is once you have the idea. The passive intellect, from Thomas Aquinas, this might be from, I believe it's from Aristotle, but I might be wrong. But this is definitely Thomas Aquinas. The passive intellect is just kind of waiting for the idea to be formed. It's just waiting. The active intellect is the one that takes the phantasm or the sense image and despoils it. The active one's active. The agent, he's doing stuff. It's that aspect. It's not a different intellect. It's that aspect of the intellect. And then once it's an idea, it's passed to the passive intellect who just receives. Unless
Yeah,
maybe in Aristotle, it might be different in Aristotle, but there's epistemology of Thomas Aquinas. The passive intellect is the goal. Once it gets to passive intellect, then you have the idea, the universal.
I think active intellect was, at least that's the terminology that Aristotle used. Passive intellect, as far as I recall, and I might be mistaken, would be the perceptual or reflexive capacity that, say, animals have. An active intellect would be kind of a higher attainment of or effort to be able to contemplate ideas and such. But whatever the terminology is, or a bunch of old stuff. But we can try to think about the kind of practical application. So, speaking for one of say idealism versus materialism, I think a point that can be minded is that if we were to designate anything and everything that exists with a single term, well, then there would be nothing with which to compare it. So if it is said that everything is matter, it's perfectly fine. What does the term matter mean, as opposed to what? What are you distinguishing from what? If we were to say that everything is mind, for example, or ideas, as Berkeley seems to have said, then what is it that things are not? So maybe a more subtle distinction could be that, starting with my own experience, I see that the proof for my own existence qua subject is precisely my own existence qua subject. The proof is in the pudding. I cannot prove my own existence via any empirical means. I can correlate certain content that may sustain modifications in an MRI scan or in an MRI machine or in a CAT scan, and I can correlate that with my subjective experience. And somebody can ask me, what's 2 plus 2? And I might say 5 or 6. Being bad at math, I might say 4, whatever the case might be. But a certain part of the brain may light up, right? But that would not be a proof of my own subjective experience. It would be merely its correlate, right? So we can say, starting from that point, I know that I exist just because I exist. It's a sort of self-existence, as far as it seems, in at least some capacity. Now, the idea of what is designated by the term matter in thoughtless naturalism or materialism, the idea would seem to be that we take this quality of self-existence that can only be found by the way of oneself, as a matter of fact, and we verbally, conceptually copy and paste it onto some of the contents of our sense perception, claiming that it exists in just that way. Meaning, again, practically speaking, I can go into a sensory deprivation tank and all of my senses can be shut down. My sight, my hearing, my touch, my taste, my smell, if we got all of them. And yet I will still to myself exist. And I will know, and I'm able to know that I exist. Right? We can designate that quality, that knowledge of so-called self-existence, by the term really existing, if we want, or by the phrase. Now, something that appears in my sentience, such as a rock, such as a primary quality or a secondary quality, whatever the case might be, it is what it is, but I am not, as a matter of fact, able to. I don't have permission to apply that quality which inheres with myself, to apply it verbally and conceptually onto that object and claim the independence and self-subsistence of it. So there's no problem, I think, to say that matter exists. In fact, there's no dispute that some such thing that would be so-called exist. And in an effort to, for example, save certain types of worldviews, such as that permit values and such as that permit higher human ideals. Certainly, idealism has been considered to be a friend of such views. right? Because if we go to vulgar naturalism, that's just it's not hospitable at all to anything that we value. It would seem, and yet any such efforts towards idealism should not take lightly the reality of what is called matter, and our ability to interface with what is called nature and to better understand its rules and regularities, and consequently to be able to have video chats like this, to be able to have amazing devices called cell phones, and to have rocket ships, and to have quantum computing and all kinds of things. We get those things by taking what we call matter and nature seriously, and really positing that it exists in a way such that is at least intersubjective, and ultimately which is not reliant on any um, contingent individuality. We find the treasure buried in the sands of Egypt. When we attribute it to ancient times, we say it really was made, say, in the time of the pharaohs or whatnot, or some in the time of something in Greece. It was made by the ancient Greeks. We don't say that this is a purely subjective, made-up phenomenon. So that's not in question. I think that that which we call matter exists in at least certain ways. What's in question is the self-subsistence, the self-existence of some of these experiences of ours, and further then reversing the causal chain and saying that some of these things that we designate by the term matter is that which causes sentience in the first place, that which causes intelligence in the first place, and that which is what an individual in all of his or her capacities really truly is. That I think we're not permitted to do, but that does not mean that we should take for our view, some or another form of radical idealism or a cosmism, meaning the denial of the reality of the phenomenal world either.
Yeah, for sure. That's yeah, you reminded me when I was listening to you that a lot of philosophers have the temptation to kind of, stress complicated arguments and hence complicated positions, but and while ignoring obvious self-evident things that we perceive, right? Reality that we perceive, that matter exists. Now, science today, apparently matter is becoming more and more mysterious, even in the scientific realm. I mean, traditionally it's defined as anything that has mass and takes up space. But even notion with space and mass is being questioned, quantum physics. But again, we cannot deny what we immediately perceive. I mean, this is the temptation of, the Parmenides and Zeno, who really want to base their philosophy on a mathematical rationalism, and there are a lot of those out there today. Descartes is, you can say, he at least provides the method for that. Even though he doesn't outright say, he would have to conclude that you start with the idea, you end with the idea. I mean, that's just how it goes. So basically, you know, Parmenides denied that there are many things, or that that's an illusion, or change is an illusion. There's just oneness. Only being is, right. That was his principle, and that's the problem. We can, and this is what happens too when we're emotional beings as creatures. So when we try to fight one extreme, we end up falling into the other extreme, right? So Parmenides and Heraclitus both, or Heraclitus, as you say in English, both two extremes. Heraclitus saying change is the basis of all things. Parmenides saying no, being is, there can't be change because then it would be non-being. So change is an illusion. That's a problem. So this synthetic position is kind of what we're looking for, and I think the one to be obtained, what is best. So going back to, for example, what you said, consciousness, that's a very difficult today. I mean, people talk about AI, and we could do another video on this. I think we talked about this before. A consciousness not being just a natural phenomenon, but that consciousness, even being a sentient being, can be artificially made, Like, can exist in the artificial realm. It doesn't have to be natural. Even the notion of life, right? Doesn't have to be natural. Could be artificial, which this is not true. AI is not conscious, right? There's no consciousness in the AI. There isn't, right? And no matter how much you program, consciousness is tied to life, right? And life has to have as a principle uh, the immaterial. So what materialists say is that no, because everyone knows there's essential difference between living things and non-things. Again, immediately evident, self-evident. So there's a essential difference. What is the difference? So materialists would have to say, well, living things are just highly complex. There's more organized matter, and this is not true at all. Well, there is some truth to that, but really there are non-living things that are pretty complex also. So it's not the complexity that makes the thing alive, right? It's what's under kind of what's under that function. Again, life. What is life? It has to have its principle of the soul. So we talk about three types of life. I mean, this is biology taken from Aristotle. You have the plant life, the animal life, and the irrational life. And what's really fascinating is that, and these are souls, right? And it's fine, philosophical souls that they exist, even though, as a Christian Catholic, only man, right? The human has the immortal soul. The other souls exist, but they die with the body, right? So we see this is also self-evident. I mean, look at a corpse. You don't treat a dog that's alive the same as you would treat a dog who's dead. Is that just due to the biological functions ceasing to work? No, there's something essentially missing there. We know that. I mean, when we go to a wake, we don't talk to the corpse like, "Hey, Fred, how's it going, Fred?" No, Fred is not there, right? We know Fred is not there. Fred is gone. We even say that. Fred, just the conjoined, workings of all the biological functions. That's absurd, right? That's to reduce us and to really to take away our dignity and worth. And we were going to talk about this also, that really our only true dignity and worth and value, going to the philosophy of value, meaning that our goodness, the fact that we are worth something, has to be um, based on an immaterial element, the fact that we have a soul. Because really, if there's no difference between a man and a rock, if it's just material, then there's no dignity there. There's no distinction there in dignity. So again, self-evident, I would even say that some material aspect is there in life, and we know it's gone when there's death. And death, by definition, what is death? By definition, well, I think medically, traditionally, it was defined as when the heart stops. Now they talk about the controversial brain death. That's very controversial. I mean, there's been people who have been apparently brain dead um, for years and have gotten out of that state, which is another interesting thing to consider. But death, even more traditionally, was defined as a separation of the body and the soul. And we see this. That the person, even the animal, is not there. The animal's not there. The animal's gone, but his body's left behind. So what is gone about the animal? What are we talking about that is gone? Right? So I don't know if you want to
Yeah,
chime
some
in
great
here.
points. Yeah. Well, we could think a little bit about what life may be, what we would wish to mean by that word, and how it can relate to us. We mentioned that certain philosophers have denied the reality of change, of time, certain aspects of the entirety of the phenomenal world, right? And how that applies to us concretely is that the one thing that I can know, I can say, I'm a materialist, I'm an idealist, quote unquote. I'm this, I'm that. I'm just my brain. I'm not my brain. Whatever I say, the one thing I know is that I want to be. I want to exist. And for those that do not, it would by necessity be due to the aspiration for some positive reality, such as the escape from a negative reality, which would be a positive aspiration, such as from pain, meaning cases of suicide and such. But otherwise, by necessity, we have to want to be. And consequently, it's a very relevant question as to how do I be? To put it that way, how do I live? Because that is what I really, truly want. So we say that the normal course of affairs would be in the state of nature to strive to aggrandize what it is that I take myself to be or what it is that I would like myself to be. For example, I am such and such individual, and this is what I like and don't like. This is my bank account and how much money there is or isn't there. This is how I feel myself to be. And now the more that I put an exclamation mark over that, the more life I will have, the more being I will have, right? I have a social media profile and it goes viral. I have millions of followers. I exist more than I did before. I attained the fame. I exist more than I did before. Right? Maybe I'll tattoo my name, my family name over me, and I say, I really truly do exist. And yet, maybe in the dark of night, maybe in the early morning, sometimes we may have this faint feeling that question: do I really exist? Right? In all my efforts to exist, I try to contribute to something, maybe to my career. I try to leave a legacy. All of this, but do I really exist? Right? So we can say from a philosophical point of view that in order to deny something, there has to be a something to deny. Right? It has baffled many generations, or at least several generations of thinkers, how to make such statements as the King of France went to eat, being that there's no longer a King of France, or that there's no golden mountain, or that there's no such thing as a unicorn. We can say that the term golden mountain, the phrase, or the term unicorn, or the phrase King of France would refer to some or another, either would be babble, nonsense, just like that, or would refer to some conception that I have in mind. And then when I go and experience that which I suppose to subsist in the phenomenal realm, in an intersubjective space, all of that would be variant to that which I would have in mind by those terms. I visualize a mountain made of pure gold. I can do that quite easily. It seems that I go look at every single mountain in the world, and each of them is other than that which I'm visualizing. That would mean the statement, there is no such thing as a golden mountain. That which I'm conceiving, I cannot perceive. So now we consequently cannot say in absolute terms, I do not exist, because who is it that does not exist? I do exist. Right? We would need to specify criteria in light of which I do not exist. And that is unfortunately for us possible. For example, the criteria of eternity, the criteria of possessing all of one's life all at once, the criteria of being self-subsistent, not in the aforementioned capacity of basic quality or whatnot, but as we wish ourselves to be, as a particular self. Right? We say that according to those criteria, we do not exist. And yet, according to other criteria, such as existing right now and right here, we do exist. So now we might suppose that being that we cannot say that there's no such thing as existence, that's just a verbal trickery, right? Nothing refers to, as was just mentioned, the comparison of two positive statements. I am conceiving of a golden mountain or of a unicorn, but perceiving something else. Therefore, there is no golden mountain. There is no unicorn. There's nothing as it concerns a golden mountain or a unicorn. So we cannot conjoin the terms absolute and nothing and claim that they have reality. Or we can, but they don't have reality. It's just mumbo jumbo. There must be existence. So it follows logically that there is existence such that fulfills every conceivable criteria of reality. And we might then offer that existence, as opposed to being some kind of sterile metaphysical abstraction, is really life itself. It's being itself, it's goodness itself. And consequently, that is what we are after. Right? And that is what we may suppose, at least symbolically, phenomenon such as we would classify as life to stand for. Living life, intelligence, freedom in and of its own self, sentience in and of its own self, and that is what we're after. Now, we say that we go after it the wrong way, right? I think that after I put an exclamation mark after my ego, after my particular private phenomenon, I will be more real. However, the message of true philosophy and true, say, theology would be that that is the exact opposite of the correct way. The correct way is, on the contrary, to die to self. The more that I get rid of the claims of self-will and selfishness and pride, the more that I love that which is above me, which ultimately shouldn't be some other figment of my fancy. You know, I love my cause, I love my whatever it might be, but I love that which must exist by necessity, hopefully, that which fulfills all the criteria of reality, or I try to love it over and above me. That's how I have life. When I live a dying life, that is how I move towards true existence and true being, aka that which I really truly want, and that which the organism that I colloquially call alive is a temporary and very temporary visibility or appearance of, or at least according to one kind of interpretation of these complicated questions.
Yeah, I like how you always end with in morality. I mean, that's how it should be. From the intellect to the will, right? If it doesn't culminate in the will, I mean, this is really useless. If this doesn't help you to live better, um, it's useless. Live according to the immaterial. It's interesting how you mentioned, because I think that's a modern philosophy. I think it's a modern fascination, a modern obsession to prove existence, which is a they kind of want to prove everything, which is you can't prove everything, right? It ultimately has to be proofs have to be based on self-evident principles. You can't prove a prove that, prove that, prove that, prove that, prove that. Ultimately, it has to be. That's just the way it is. And it's funny how Descartes wanted to solve more certain the thinking, in the sense that the thinking was the premise and the conclusion was I exist. I think, therefore I am, which is fascinating. None of the classical or medieval philosophers even it never even passed their mind to question existence. I mean, existence is the first principle of philosophizing. But it's kind of like how modern philosophy has interchanged those values, and it's fascinating. It has brought about epistemology, which is a new epistemology is a modern is part the inheritance of modern philosophy. Um, because I mean, the classical medieval philosophers were just realists. So yeah, definitely we must live according to the immaterial, and we are more immaterial than we are material. I mean, the reality of you, the reality of Jeremy, for example, is much more profoundly immaterial. But because naturally speaking, we need to go through the visible, we need to go through the material. The materials are signs. So kind of taking a Platonic twist to this, concluding, we live in the world of signs. So really, signs mean something, and the meaning is that profound reality, which is the immaterial soul deep down, right? God being the ultimate immaterial reality. But how do I show who I am? How do I show my immaterial reality? Through the visible reality of my body, right? So we are in this world of symbols, of signs, but they point to this immaterial realm. And yes, we must live according to that. And that's what it means to be a philosopher. So a philosopher is more of a doer, or at least it's a culminator of, it culminates in doing, right? The classics did believe that, you do philosophy, right? You live philosophy. It's not like this, it's not a sterile intellectualism. We're just like talking about ideas, but it's something that we should ruminate. Um, I like that verb, or meditate, um, in order so we can assume, right, this philosophy, which is ultimately stresses the immaterial, right? What the signs signify. Do not be part and parcel, right? Do not really live according to the material, but beyond that. So really, materialists are superficial, and they cannot live a transcendental life. They cannot live a fulfilling life by definition, right? Because matter is finite. So will your happiness will be so. In conclusion, let our happiness be finite, and really, By definition, the only way we can fulfill our infinite thirst for happiness is by, the infinitude of the immateriality, and that is God Himself. So I don't know, any last words here for, I'll give you the last word before we end.
Well said, Professor. We could wrap up, I think, by saying that this conversation of brain, quote unquote, consciousness, all this, it's sorely in need of sincerity. As a Catholic philosopher, Jacques Maritain, he told himself that if I don't discover the meaning of life in a year, I'll take my life.
Oh, that's
That's
right.
being a
Him and
little
his
bit
wife.
extreme.
I think him and his
Hmm?
wife decided to do that for themselves.
Maybe right. I think he was married by that time, right? So him and his wife. So whatever that is, we're not by any means recommending that, but that's sincerity. That is somebody that puts their money where their mouth
Yeah,
is.
sure.
On the very opposite spectrum, or on the very opposite side here, would be an individual that spends his or her whole life preaching the gospel of pure, say, um, uh, kind of reductionism, right? Of reducing anything that a person could be uh, to neurons, to the brain, to the neurochemistry, this and that, and then goes home to their family, tucks their kids in bed, right? Says I love you, says I'm for world peace, this and that. Whatever you may say, if it is a fact that I am nothing more than simply certain phenomenal content, ultimately, that, as we said, has to come to me in my own sentience. If that is all that I am, well, then I can do with myself as I please. This little wrapper here, it's trash. It's just a piece of matter. I can toss it out. So I get bored of myself. I can and should then toss myself out. I mean nothing, and I can never be anything. That is the sincere position. And some such thinkers, they're consistent. There's a famous American thinker that says that all consciousness is an illusion. Dennett, if you've heard of him, Daniel Dennett, consciousness is an illusion. It's just completely non-existent. And he pursues his career. Right? He has a family, I believe, and so forth and so on. Right. So again, that is still hypocritical. Ultimately, I treat objects as objects, and I treat persons as persons because I believe that a person is a person. I start with myself. I acknowledge my own existence. It is difficult when I've led a degenerate life and I have no self consciousness. I have only consciousness of objects and their modifications, but I at least can try to acknowledge that, humble myself a little bit, start with whatever slight inner life that I do have, and then I can attribute it to other people, and hopefully then we can attain to the consistency and sincerity that, again, any kind of such discussion certainly demands.
Yeah, for sure. Very well said as a conclusion. I just want to say the obvious that really, um, the materialists are affirming what they're denying. We've mentioned this before. I mean, they're making the metaphysical universal claim that all things are matter, but that makes no sense to a materialist. To make any type of universal claim is absurd, right? So yeah, it's an inherent contradiction, and a lot of these intellectual problems are based on moral problems. I mean, Jesus said to be good as a dove and clever as a snake. And I think he said be clever as a snake first in another parallel. So not to be cynical or anything, but a lot of these intellectual problems, they're just so blatantly bad and wrong that they have to stem from moral problems, right? It's just really no other explanations. Like atheism, for example, as Scripture says, the fool is an atheist. That's totally true. The God is, a reality that can be easily proved. So a lot of these are moral problems, not intellectual problems. Where the person who one time there was a priest talking about the soul and heaven, and interestingly the atheist went up to him and said, Father, I can't believe in it. He said, you're right. The guy said to the priest, I understand your arguments, I see them, but I just can't believe. And the priest said, well, don't say you can't believe, just say you won't believe. Right? There's a difference here. So here's the will's trumping the intellect. Here the will is
Right.
clouding the intellect. And that's the problem here. So I think.
The idea,
Mhm.
yeah, no, great point, Zach. I mean, the idea that truth can be pursued in any capacity aside from that which directly concerns self interest in isolation and alienation from the development of character. And a healthy conscience is preposterous. My entire intellect, my entire tool for perceiving the world and for conceiving of ideas is so distorted. And when I do violence, moral violence onto myself, we see that an individual that does not strive for character, that does not strive for a higher human life, cannot take the first step forward on
Right,
any
that's right. I think it'll be an interesting video.
kind of
Maybe we
genuine
could do.
pursuit
Sorry.
of truth, and does not want to either.
Right. I think it'll
Their
be good to
desires
do.
remain.
No, I'm sorry. I think there's a pause here. I think it would be good to do a video between like the intellectual and the moral, the relationship. That'll be really fascinating, and I think it will be an eye opener. So that'll be good. That's a good idea for the. But anyway, we'll end it here. Thank you very much to Jeremy. God bless you all, and until next time, we'll see you.